What if the woman every respectable family called an embarrassment turned out to be the only one worth keeping? What if the man the whole territory feared walked past silk dresses and painted smiles and stopped for the one left weeping on a platform in the mud? And what if that single, quiet choice unraveled a conspiracy so vicious it would have seen her dead before the first snow? Remember this, because the story will ask you to remember it. The weight the world cannot carry is exactly what the wilderness requires. The year was 1873, and the railroad had just finished driving its last iron spike through the high basin country of the Wyoming Territory, a stretch of land so vast and indifferent it made small ambitions look like insults against the sky. Settlers and speculators had been flooding in for 2 seasons, men of appetite and lawyers with soft hands, all of them chasing something the land had not yet agreed to give them. The town of Calderwood had sprung up along the main spur line with the frantic energy of a place that believes it will become important before it has earned the right to believe anything. There was a hotel, a courthouse still smelling of raw pine, 3 competing dry goods stores, and a land office run by a man named Harlan Voss. The women of Calderwood organized their world according to a precise taxonomy of worth: waist measurement, family name, complexion, and the ability to produce a correct curtsy before a man of means. By these measures they knew exactly where everyone stood, and they were not shy about saying so. Voss was 51 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that had gone to softness, with a silver watch chain he touched whenever he was calculating something, and small, water-colored eyes that never warmed even when his mouth was smiling. He held the deed records for every parcel in the basin, and for 3 years he had been quietly, methodically falsifying survey boundaries to absorb the best grazing land and richest creek bottomland into parcels held under shell names that all traced, if anyone had cared to look, back to himself. Nobody looked. Voss was on the church committee, the school building fund, and the welcoming party for the territorial governor. His charity was theatrical, and his cruelty was private, and in Calderwood, those were the credentials of a gentleman. Voss had a stepdaughter. Her name was Nora Pell, and she had been his ward since her mother's death 4 years prior, when Nora was 19. She was 23 in the autumn of 1873, and she was large, not large in any way that apologized for itself. She stood 5 feet 9 inches in her boots, with broad shoulders, thick, capable hands, and a presence that filled a room without her trying, but large in the way Calderwood's taxonomy could not accommodate and so simply condemned. The women said she moved like a draft horse. The men pretended she didn't exist, which was easier and crueler than mockery. Her stepfather, in his more public moments, called her ungainly and sighed about the burden of it. In private he told her she had the look of something that had gone wrong in the making, and that her best hope was invisibility. Nora had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's instinct for reading the weather in a man's face, and she had spent 4 years reading Harlan Voss and understanding, without being able to name it fully, that he was building towards something she would not survive. She knew only the small, daily architecture of her diminishment. She ate after the household. She wore her mother's remade dresses 2 sizes too tight at the seam. She was not introduced at social functions, but positioned near the refreshment table where her size could be useful, and her presence easily ignored. She had taught herself to read surveying maps from the books in Voss's office, because the maps were the only things in the house that felt like truth. She did not know that this skill was recording a crime. She thought she was only passing time. The autumn of 1873 brought the Calderwood matrimonial arrangement. 12 women recruited from St. Louis and Cincinnati through the Methodist Mission Board, respectable women, Voss had specified, meaning slender, meaning presentable. The arrangement had been Voss's idea, and he had used it to stage a very public piece of theater. He intended to send Nora away on the same train that brought the brides in. He had arranged, without telling her, for her to be handed to a man named Cutter Doyle, who ran a labor crew near the Montana line, not as a wife, but as a domestic, in exchange for a cash consideration Voss would pocket and a release of whatever claim Nora might make under her mother's original will. The reason was simple and monstrous. Nora's mother's will left Nora entitlement to the original Pell homestead, 160 acres sitting directly above the most productive aquifer in the basin. Land Voss had already quietly resurveyed under his shell name and was about to sell to a railroad subsidiary for $12,000. Nora living, and Nora possibly one day hiring a lawyer, were the only obstacles between Voss and clean money. He had arranged for the domestic deal to be the polite version of her removal. He had arranged for Cutter Doyle to be the brutal version if the polite one failed. Nora knew none of this when she arrived at the Calderwood Depot on the morning the bride train came in. She had been told only that she was to assist with the reception. She arrived at the platform and found herself immediately useful in the way large, competent women are always made useful at events designed to celebrate other people. She carried the reception baskets. She directed the porter. She kept the welcome table from blowing over in the October wind. The 12 women stepped off the train to the town's full pageantry of flowers and introductions, and the particular bright-eyed attention of men deciding. Nora stood at the edge of it and watched, and when Voss caught her eye across the platform, he gave her a small, satisfied smile that she felt in her sternum like a premonition. It was then that she noticed the man who was not participating. He stood at the far end of the platform near the freight car, broad-backed and still, dressed in canvas and worn leather, with the quality of stillness that belongs either to very patient predators or to men who have been alone long enough that crowds have become something they observe rather than join. His name was Eli Marsh, and Calderwood knew it mostly as a name said quietly. He was 38 years old and had been running a remote cattle and timber claim in the Upper Basin for 6 years, trading his timber contracts in once a season, and otherwise remaining a rumor the mountains generated. He was feared not because he had done violence, though there were stories, but because he clearly could and clearly did not need anything from anyone, and to a town organized around mutual dependency and social leverage, that quality read as dangerous. He had come to the platform to collect fencing equipment and 2 crates of books ordered from a publisher in Chicago. He was not there for the brides. He saw the collision before Nora felt it. One of the reception baskets caught the wind and swung hard into her side. The table edge caught her hip, and she stumbled forward into the mud at the platform's edge, sprawling with the full, graceless weight that her stepfather's voice was always narrating in her head. The laughter was immediate and came from enough of the assembled men to constitute a verdict. One of the arriving women put a gloved hand over her mouth. Harlan Voss watched and kept his small, satisfied smile. Nora pushed herself up from the mud, hands shaking, jaw set, and said, evenly, to no one in particular with a steadiness that cost her everything she had, "I believe I'm done assisting." She picked up the one basket that had not fallen and turned to carry it to the station house. Eli Marsh, from the far end of the platform, watched all of it with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. He did not laugh. Voss moved quickly. Within the hour he had Nora brought to his office and told her, with the brisk efficiency of a man closing a ledger entry, that he had secured her a position in the North and that she would leave on tomorrow's freight run. He said it was a respectable housekeeping arrangement, that her size made her suited to the labor, that she ought to be grateful anyone would take her. Nora asked the name of the employer. Voss hesitated one beat too long, and then said it was a man who ran a timber operation, and that the details were in a letter she would receive on departure. She looked at her stepfather's watercolored eyes and saw, very clearly, that he was not worried about whether she would be safe. She said, "You need me gone." Voss smiled. "I need you settled. There is a difference." There was not. But Nora had no money of her own, no horse, and no ally in Calderwood she could trust before morning. So she went home and sat with the surveying maps she had been quietly studying for 3 years, and she took 2 of them. She folded them inside her mother's Bible and put the Bible in her bag. She did not know exactly what she was taking. She suspected it was something. The freight wagon north left before dawn, driven by a taciturn man named Gideon, contracted by Voss, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim. 3 miles out of Calderwood, Nora understood from the waypoint signs on the freight road, and from Gideon's unguarded mention of the relay station's name, that the wagon was not going to a timber operation. It was going to the Eastern Relay Station, where Cutter Doyle's crew staged between jobs. Nora said nothing. She sat in the cold dawn among crates of dry goods and coils of rope, and began, slowly, to understand the full shape of what Voss had been building. The understanding arrived not as panic, but as a cold, clarifying fury that felt, for the first time in 4 years, like solid ground beneath her feet. She had not expected the wagon to stop at the Marsh timber claim, 11 miles north along the same freight road. But Gideon had a side contract to deliver Marsh's fencing supplies, and so the wagon turned off the main road and climbed a long switchback into the upper basin. When it stopped in the yard, Nora climbed down with her bag and her Bible and stood in the cold morning air and looked at what Eli Marsh had built. It was not a rough man's hovel. It was a log house with a full 2nd story and glass windows and a stone chimney throwing real heat. Beside it, a tight barn and a smithing shed with tools arrayed on shelving with the precision of a man who respected his instruments. There was a kitchen garden put to bed for winter, with mulch laid in careful rows. A fence line ran true and level as a carpenter's chalk mark as far as she could see. Marsh came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He looked at the freight, then at Nora. She was standing in his yard, with mud on her green dress from the platform that morning, and her chin up at an angle that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with the decision not to collapse. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. He said, "Gideon, what is she doing on a freight wagon in November?" Gideon explained there was a placement, a housekeeping situation up at the relay. Marsh looked at the relay station name on the manifest. Something in the stillness around him changed, the way the quality of silence in a canyon changes when something is moving at its far end. He said, "She's not going to the relay station." Gideon said it was Voss's arrangement. Marsh said, "I'll deal with Voss. Unload my freight." Nora watched this and said, because she had decided in the wagon that she was done being managed, "I appreciate the intervention. I also don't know you, and I'm not trading one arrangement for another." Marsh looked at her with something she could not immediately classify, not pity, not condescension, but very close to respect. He said, "Fair, you can stay or you can go. The relay station will be what it is, and the road back to Calderwood is 11 miles. Your choice." He said it as though he genuinely meant it was her choice. Nora looked at the glass windows and the straight fence and the smoke from the chimney, and she said, "I'll stay through winter. I earn my keep." Marsh said, "You will." That was the negotiation. It lasted 90 seconds, and it was the most honest conversation Nora Pell had conducted in 4 years. The days that followed remade her in increments too small to name while they were happening. Marsh ran the claim with systematic rigor, 800 acres deeded cleanly and surveyed by a man named Albrecht, who was the only surveyor in the basin. Voss had not been able to compromise. He ran 40 head of cattle through the lower meadows and harvested timber selectively from the upper slopes, replanting in the gaps because, he told Nora once, without ceremony, a man who cuts without planting is only pretending to own something. He kept a clean house and had 3 shelves of books, ranging from engineering texts to Shakespeare to a natural history of North American grasses. He was not warm in the way warmth is usually performed. He was warm in the way a well-built structure is warm, because the material was good and the construction was honest. He did not once make a remark about Nora's size. On the 4th day, when she moved a hay bale wedged under the barn door, placed her shoulder against it, and drove it free without complaint, he watched and said, "Most men I've hired can't shift that alone." Nora said it was only a bale. He said, "It's only a bale to someone strong enough to know it." She filed that sentence away with the same care with which she had filed the surveying maps. She showed him the maps 3 weeks in, on a night when the first real snow was building against the windows, and they were eating at the kitchen table by lamplight. She had spent those weeks confirming, by comparing his Albrecht survey against the maps from Voss's office, what the falsifications meant. She set the folded maps on the table between the plates and said, "My stepfather has been redrawing parcel boundaries for at least 2 years. The Pell homestead, my mother's land, has been resurveyed under a company name I can trace to him. He's selling it to a railroad subsidiary for $12,000. She tapped the map. "The aquifer runs under the Pell parcel and under 3 other original homesteads he's absorbed. He owns the water for 40 square miles if the sale goes through." Marsh studied the maps for a long time, studying her annotations, the reference numbers she had cross-checked, the dates. He said, "How long did it take you to read these?" She said, 3 years of afternoons." He sat back. He said quietly, with the conviction of a man reporting what he sees, "You are the most dangerous thing Harlan Voss has in this territory." Nora felt something shift in her chest that had been locked in place for years. She said, "Then let's be dangerous together." Marsh looked at her across the lamplight and said, "Already am." They sent a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne with copied map evidence. Copies Nora made herself with the drafting instruments from Marsh's smithing shed. And to a territorial judge named Corwin, who had a reputation for indifference to Calderwood's social hierarchy because he was based 90 miles away and had never needed Voss for anything. The legal mechanism was straightforward if slow. Nora, as her mother's documented heir under the original 1869 will, had standing to challenge the resurveying and retitling of the Pell parcel on grounds of fraudulent boundary alteration. If supported by a legitimate counter-survey, the claim could freeze the sale and trigger a fraud investigation. Albrecht agreed to conduct the counter-survey because he was also the one surveyor in the basin who had been asked by Voss to adjust a number years ago and had refused, and who had been nursing that refusal ever since. The law would move in its own time. The problem was that Voss would not. The first sign came in late January, a rider seen at the lower meadow fence, not a neighboring hand, not a trapper, simply a rider who stopped and looked at the Marsh place from a distance and rode away without cause. Marsh saw it too and said, "We're being measured." He spent the next 2 weeks reinforcing the barn door with iron bar brackets, moving the cattle to the high meadow where terrain channeled approach, and checking and cleaning the 2 rifles and the shotgun. He showed Nora, without condescension, how each one operated, the loading, the balance, the management of recoil, the specific patience required to shoot accurately when the hands want to shake. He told her that strength without precision was noise, and that she had the strength, and that precision was only practice. She practiced. Her hands were steady, her eye was good, and she had 4 years of suppressed fury to discipline into stillness, which is exactly what accurate shooting requires. The snow of February suited her. She learned the upper basin the way Marsh knew it, by feel and by landmark, by the language of snowpack that told you where the ground was soft and where it would hold, by which timber paths would take weight, and which would collapse a horse's leg into a hidden creek bed. She learned to read the weather 2 hours, out by the color of clouds over the eastern ridge. By March, she was not the woman who had stood in the mud at the Calderwood platform. She was something the platform had not been able to contain. The weight the world cannot carry, she thought sometimes, is exactly what the wilderness requires. Cutter Doyle's men came in the third week of March, 4 of them, on a morning when Marsh was at the upper fence line and Nora was in the barn. She heard the horses before she saw them. 4 horses, unhurried, coming up the main track in the yellow morning light, spread out and deliberate in the way of men, covering a yard rather than making a call. She had the shotgun from its hook before the lead rider spoke. He was a large man with a beard, grown for a cold job and flat professional eyes, and he called into the yard that they had business with the woman Pell, and that she should come out, and nobody needed to make it complicated. Nora assessed. 4 men, 4 horses, Marsh absent, the yard open. She called back through the barn door gap. "State your business from there." The man said Harlan Voss sent his regards and that she was going to sign a document releasing all claim to the Pell parcel, and that it would go easier if she cooperated. She said, "I've already sent my cooperation to the territorial judge in Cheyenne. You're about 40 days behind the situation." A pause, and then the sound of the men moving to flank the barn, and she understood that the document was a formality they had not actually expected her to sign. She fired the shotgun through the upper barn window into the open air above the lead rider's head. Not to hit, to establish that she was armed and willing, and in the half-second of chaos that produced, she came through the side barn door, low and fast, in a direction they had not calculated. The side door exited behind the hay shelter, and the hay shelter sat against the slope she had spent 2 months memorizing. The creek bed was 20 yards beyond, running hard with March snowmelt. 4 horses would not cross it quickly. She crossed it at a run. She circled north along the timberline. She was large, and she was fast, and she was in her own terrain, and she had 4 years of suppressed fury, disciplined now into something precise and purposeful and entirely her own. She found Marsh at the upper fence line when the first shot from the yard reached them as a faint report. He was already moving. She told him what she had seen and what she had done in 10 words, and then they went back down the timberline together, fast and quiet, flanking the 4 men from the high ground. The fight was brief and brutal and entirely in favor of people who knew where the creek bed was. 2 of Doyle's men tried to cross it and went down in the snowmelt and were taken in the mud without injury. 1 ran for the road, which Marsh said was fine because a runner carried a story back to Voss faster than a telegram. The lead man had made it to the barn and barricaded himself, and it was Nora who talked him out, standing outside the barn door in the cold morning with the shotgun at her side, telling him with the complete calm of a woman who no longer has a single fear left to manage. "The judge in Cheyenne has our evidence as of 3 weeks ago, and the land office is already conducting a preliminary review. Harlan Voss has nothing left to pay you with. Come out." He came out. In the saddlebags of the lead man's horse, they found a document that was more than Voss had intended to leave in the physical world. A signed instruction in his own handwriting, directing the men to ensure that Nora Pell not return to Calderwood under any circumstances, and that her departure be made to look consistent with a frontier accident. In the language of a territorial court, it was a written solicitation to commit murder for hire. Nora held it in both hands and read it twice and handed it to Marsh without speaking. He read it, folded it carefully, and said, "This goes to Judge Corwin with the maps." It did. The legal proceedings moved with a speed unusual for the territory and entirely consistent with the quality of evidence presented. Albrecht's counter-survey confirmed boundary falsifications on 9 parcels across the basin. The fraudulent retitling of the Pell parcel was overturned by order of the territorial court in April, restoring 160 acres to Nora as her mother's legal heir. The murder-for-hire letter was forwarded to the territorial marshal, along with the testimony of two men Voss had paid over the years, men who found cooperation with the prosecution considerably more attractive than loyalty to a collapsed scheme. Harlan Voss was arrested on the 14th of April, 1874, at his land office desk in the middle of a meeting with the railroad subsidiary representative, which made the arrest both public and satisfying, in a way Calderwood discussed for 2 decades afterward. He was convicted on 11 counts of fraudulent survey alteration and 1 count of solicitation, and sentenced in August to 14 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. He served 9 before his health broke. The silver watch chain and the church committee seat were gone before the ink on the conviction was dry. The land he had stolen was returned, parcel by parcel, to its original holders. The railroad sale collapsed entirely, and the aquifer, the real prize the whole conspiracy had been built around, remained what it had always been meant to be, common and necessary, and not for sale. Nora sold 20 acres of the Pell parcel to fund the boundary restoration legal fees for 2 neighboring families who could not have pursued their claims without help, and she kept the remaining 140 acres and the water rights. The land was appraised in the summer of 1874 at $9,000, which made her a woman of independent and substantial means at 24 years old. She was also in love. On a morning in April when the snow was finally breaking and the first green was showing at the creek edges, Marsh had told her, while she stood looking at the land that was now legally hers, that she was exactly the kind of person a country needed to survive itself. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without performance and without apology, as a plain statement of observed fact. She kissed him in the spring mud without ceremony, and he kissed her back with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who does nothing carelessly. And the mountains did not comment on any of it, which was appropriate, because the mountains had known all winter what was coming. They married in June of 1874 in a small ceremony at the claim, conducted by Judge Corwin himself, who turned out to be a man of warmth and dry humor when not wearing his official bearing. 4 people attended. Albrecht the surveyor, Gideon the wagon driver who arrived with a written apology he had clearly spent weeks composing, and 2 neighboring homesteaders whose parcels had been restored through Nora's evidence. The Calderwood newspaper reported the marriage in 3 lines and spelled her name correctly for the first time, which she noted without comment and found privately satisfying. The 12 brides who had arrived on the autumn train were variously settled and variously happy by June, and not one of them had ended up with the life Voss's theater was meant to produce, because the theater had burned down from the inside out, and the stage had been someone else's entirely. Calderwood adjusted its taxonomy, as all such towns must, when the woman they left in the mud turns out to own the water. Marsh turned out to be, in marriage, precisely what he had been in the yard that first November morning. A man whose honesty was structural rather than occasional, who repaired what broke and said what he meant, and found Nora, specifically Nora, the most interesting person in his considerable range of experience. He said so regularly and without diminishment. They ran the combined claim together, Nora managing the parcel records and water rights with a precision that made Albrecht tell people for the rest of his career that she was the finest lay surveyor he had ever encountered, and Marsh managing the timber and cattle with the same systematic care he had always brought to things that mattered. They had 3 children, all of them large, all of them capable, none of them apologized for. By 1880, the Marsh claim was one of the most securely titled properties in the basin, because Nora had built a paper record so airtight that no land office in the territory could have touched it with a fraudulent pen, and she had done it because she had learned, from the worst possible teacher, in the worst possible school, exactly how the fraud was done. The world had called her an embarrassment, a burden, a thing that had gone wrong in the making, and it had been wrong in the specific and comprehensive way that small cruelty is always wrong, not just morally, but practically. Not just unkindly, but unintelligently. It had looked at her and seen inconvenience, and had not seen the surveying mind, the physical courage, the patient fury that were all there, all along, waiting for a terrain that needed them. Harlan Voss had needed her gone because she was dangerous. He was right about the danger. He was catastrophically wrong about the direction it would travel. Remember what this story asked you to hold at the very beginning? The weight the world cannot carry is exactly what the wilderness requires. The wilderness knew. The man who lived in it knew. And Nora Pell, who became Nora Marsh, who owned the water and the land and the clean records and the spring mud and the life that no one in Calderwood had imagined for her. She had known it too. She had known it in her bones, in her broad, capable hands, in the steadiness she preserved through 4 years of diminishment, in the fury she had finally found a use for. She had simply been waiting for a world large enough to hold her,